Peace, 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 family. This is your girl Navi. We're getting ready to do some reading here, but I ran across a little book set, which you can see in the thumbnail, caught my attention. And I've done a little bit of research on it, not a lot, just a little bit, and I find this quite interesting. I'm curious about this work here. We find that this gentleman, William Irving, was an essayist, a historian, a writer. Um, He actually apparently is the one that wrote Rip Van Winkle, I believe it is, one of his short stories. But as I was leaving an establishment, I happened to see these books in a case. And as I was looking just to see what the title was, I saw something about Moorish history. I was like, what? Moorish Chronicle, I think it is. Oliver Goldsmith, uh, the crayon papers, Moorish Chronicle, and then some stuff about George Washington. Y'all can see the titles on the thumbnail. Christopher Columbus, his companions, um, Muhammad and his successors. Something about the history of New York, which I started to read that earlier. And then I decided to look up Washington Irving to see who exactly he was. And I found out a little bit about the writing of that book and chose not to read that one live. I'm not sure how far we're going to get in any of this live reading because I probably should have done this 2 hours ago because a girl is tired today. Okay. For some reason, I got really sleepy. But one of the books in here that I was curious about, we're going to actually read a little bit of that today. And this one is going to be the sketchbook Legends of the Conquest of Spain, the life of Washington Irving. Now, I don't have my computer with me right now, so we're just doing the tablet and the phone and the headset. And I'm hoping I'm not spitting in the mic and y'all getting these high sounding P's and these overly slurring S's or anything like that. But y'all know I got a lisp, so it is what it is, right? But I do have my tablet up on Wikipedia to read just a little bit about Washington Irving. As I was telling a friend, I found it quite interesting that Washington Irving supposedly met his hero, who was George Washington, at the age of 6. And George Washington met his bigger half brother at that same age. I believe it was that same age. Might have been 9, but I think it was 6 as well. So I find that quite interesting. And another thing that I find quite interesting about these stories, because I was like, oh, I done found some real old history, somebody talking about some stuff in the 18th century, um, the 1800s, and then to find out that some of the stuff was kind of embellished a little bit, especially on the history of Mr. Knickerbocker, who the New York Knickerbockers were named after uh, in Washington Irving stories. I was enjoying that story, and then like I said, found out he kind of embellished a few things about the story that it wasn't a real story. And what we know in this, as far as storytelling, myth making, and the like, is that there were a lot of people out here writing stories, and some of those stories have become fact, like a woman jumping out of the rib of a man. Never mind, my bad. My bad. Tourette's kicked in again. Um, another thing that I found kind of curious, and I don't know if this is going to be the case with this, is how we've really believed this Moorish story. And I hate to go there, but that's the book that caught my attention. Okay, this Moorish story, but then we have, as we found out earlier, we have Barnum and Bailey Circus, we have the Chautauqua, the Lyceum movement as well. Um, these shows and theaters that were going on, pseudo writers and stuff like that, and every pseudonym in the book, as far as a name is concerned, that were giving stories that may or may not be true. But what I do find interesting in this is that you will find little bits of history inside stories, whether they're fictionally written, embellished, or 100% fact, you know. So, like in his book, the one about the history of New York, there were some places that were named in there that would have been curious, certain hotels that were named in there that would have been interesting because you got to mix a little bit of truth with your falsehood, right? Um, but on this one that as I started reading it, this part is going to be written by Richard Henry Stoddard. And for anybody who's out here in the area where I am, you know, we got Stoddard Wells Road, right? Yeah, I found that interesting. And even as I was reading this, a little bit about his family, and this may not have any connection, but I found it interesting. And they were talking about the Irving ancestors, if you would. That's another little curious thing that shows up in here. For those of you who have shown up, and I welcome and thank you guys for coming. But those of you who have come in here and are still on your research role, you know, looking up information, you might want to grab your pencils and papers and all of this and try to catch some of these names as they show up. There may be something of interest for you. But um, Mr. Irving, in this particular volume, he went to visit the Alhambra. Wikipedia shows a little bit of his history, and I had trouble finding one of the books via Wikipedia, but um, they talk a little bit about his history when he wrote certain books, and he went over to the Alhambra. Um, and I think he was intending to write another book, but he was doing research for another book, and basically from that story it looks like two books came out of this instead of just one. And I'm really looking at the fact of either people were speed reading, they were super awesome and amazing as far as what they could write, or they just didn't have anything to do to sit down and write all these books back to back to back and put all this stuff together. Either way, okay, I do find that quite awe-inspiring, if you would. But you know, when we got all these pseudo writers, who knows? It could have been a bunch of them, you know. But anyway, let me read a little bit before I get into his story. Like I said, I don't know how much of this I'm going to read, but you might find some interesting little names and titles and places in dealing with this that it's a possibility you haven't ran across before. So just you know, if you guys can just sit back and enjoy the read because there's some stuff going on social media that I can't. I ain't that slow on my worst day. Okay, I just can't get with some of the stuff that's going on right now. So we're gonna let some cream rise to the top and move myself out the fray by reading a little bit. Okay, but let's start out with Wikipedia here, talking about Washington Irving. And if you guys have Wikipedia, just type it in, and then you can see um, for yourself, and maybe you can garner or gather how these stories come about. And let me say something else as I'm saying that. As I'm looking at this, like the part about Rip Van Winkle and also the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which you see on Wikipedia, it's really interesting, and it has nothing to do with anybody online per se. um, it's just the way synchronicity works. I do remember the brothers talking about somebody writing fiction X, Y, and Z, and they mentioned Rip Van Winkle, which I actually saw it when they were talking about it because I was in the background just, you know, searching up some of the stuff that they said. And, you know, like I said, they mentioned it. And then to independently run across this volume set, and there's probably about three books missing from it, but to run across this set and then look in here and find out that this is the guy who wrote Rip Van Winkle that they were talking about. I mean, some people think that, you know, people have been feeding me information and they don't understand. I keep telling y'all for years I stumble across shit. Okay. And so I find this really interesting that certain stories that we may have taken as fact or even read them as children or in school for history or whatever the case is, you know, however that literature, whatever. Um, pops out and shows us who they are. You know, I'm kind of questioning whether these stories are real to a great extent right now, because what is a fact? Something that people agree upon, right? So, um, if you're here, sit back and listen. If you come later, hope you enjoy the read, and I'm gonna try to do my best to read this with the proper context. But let's read a little bit from Wikipedia to know a little bit about Washington Irving. So Washington Irving was born April 3rd, 1783, and passed away on November 28th, 1859. He was an American short story writer, essayist, biographer, historian, and diplomat of the early 19th century. He wrote the short stories Rip Van Winkle, 1819, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820, both of which appeared in his collection, The Sketchbook of Godfrey Crayon, Gentleman. Well, it says gent, but gentleman. It says his historical works include biographies of Oliver Goldsmith, Muhammad, and George Washington, as well as several histories of 15th century Spain that deal with subjects such as the Alhambra, Christopher Columbus, and the Moors. Irving served as American ambassador to Spain in the 1840s. Um, Irving was born and raised in Manhattan to a merchant family. He made his literary debut in 1802 with a series of observational letters to the Morning Chronicle, written under the pseudonym Jonathan Oldstyle. He temporarily moved to England for his family business in 1815, where he achieved fame with the publication of the sketchbook of Godfrey Crayon Gent, which was serialized from 1819 to 1820. He continued to publish regularly throughout his life, and he completed a 5-volume biography of George Washington just 8 months before his death at the age of 76 in Tarrytown, New York. Okay. Irving was one of the first American writers to earn acclaim in Europe, and he encouraged other American authors such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe. He was also admired by some British writers, including Lord Byron, Thomas Campbell, Charles Dickens, Mary Shelley, Francis Jeffrey, and Walter Scott. He advocated for writing as a legitimate profession and argued for stronger laws to protect American writers from copyright infringement. Let's look at his legacy. They don't have anything for his biography, so let's look at his legacy from Wikipedia. It says Irving is largely credited as the first American man of letters and the first to earn his living solely by his pen. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow acknowledged Irving's role in promoting American literature in December 1859. Quote, "We feel a just pride in his renown as an author, not forgetting that to his other claims upon our gratitude, he adds also that of having been the first to win for our country an an honorable name and position in the history of letters." End quote. Now, in the book that we will be reading, or the parts of the book that we will be reading here today, they mentioned the Republic of Letters. Hey, you guys, Focus Mine and the Enemy's Public. I see y'all. It didn't show me that y'all had been in here. Okay, but let's continue a little bit. So it says, and y'all should remember the Republic of Letters. That's the whole thing. Okay. Irving perfected the American short story and was the first American writer to set his stories firmly in the United States, even as he poached from German or Dutch folklore. He is also generally credited as one of the first to write in the vernacular and without an obligation to presenting morals or being didactic in his short stories, writing stories simply to entertain rather than to enlighten. He also encouraged many would-be writers. As George William Curtis noted there, quote, is not a young literary aspirant in the country who, if he ever personally met Irving, did not hear from him the kindest words of sympathy, regard, and encouragement, end quote. Edgar Allan Poe, on the other hand, felt that Irving should be given credit for being an innovator, but that the writing itself was often unsophisticated. Quote, Irving is much overrated, end quote, Poe wrote in 1838. And, quote, well, quote, and a nice distinction might be drawn between his jest and his surreptitious and adventurous reputation, between what is due to the pioneer solely and what to the writer, end quote. A critic for the New York Mirror wrote, quote, no man in the Republic of Letters has been more overrated than Mr. Washington Irving, end quote. Some critics acclaim that Irving catered to British sensibilities, and one critic charged that he wrote, quote, of and for England rather than his own country, end quote. For instance, American critic John Neal, in his 1824 through 25 critical work, American Writers, dismissed Irving as a poor copy of Goldsmith. So you know we're going to have to read Goldsmith at some particular point, or at least peruse that book. Let's continue here from Wikipedia. Other critics were more supportive of Irving's style. William Makepeace Thackeray was the first to refer to Irving as the ambassador whom the New York, I'm sorry, to refer to Irving as, quote, the ambassador whom the New World of Letters sent to the Old, end quote. A banner picked up by writers and critics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Quote, he is the first of the American humorists, as he is almost the first of the American writers, end quote, wrote critic H.R. Hollis, Hawless, in 1881. Quote, yet belonging to the New World, there is a quaint old world flavor about him, end quote. Early critics often had difficulty separating Irving the man from Irving the writer. Quote, the life of Washington Irving was one of the brightest ever led by an author, wrote Richard Henry Stoddard, an early Irving biographer. Later critics, however, began to review his writings as all style with no substance. Quote, the man had no message, end quote, said critic Barrett Wendell. Okay. So I guess for the sake of argument, we can look at this as learning about a writing style as opposed to truth, maybe. Okay. Let's continue. It says, as a historian, Irving's reputation had fallen out of favor but then gained a resurgence. Quote, with the advent of scientific history in the generations that followed his, Irving's historical writings lapsed in disregard and disrespect. To late 19th and early 20th century historians, including John Franklin Jameson, and I know y'all have said that name recently, the last name at least, G.P. Gooch, and others, these works were demurramences, demurramences, never seen that word before, worthy at best of veiled condescension. However, more recently, several of Irving's histories and biographies have again won praise for his reliability as well as the literary skill with which they were written. Specifically, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, Astoria, or Anecdotes of an Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains, and Life of George Washington have earned respect of scholars whose writings on those topics were considered authoritative in our generation. Samuel Eliot Morison, Bernard DeVato, Douglas Southall Freeman, I guess those were the ones who wrote on George Washington. Uh, I don't really want to read all of this, but we just want to find out about a little bit about this guy before we start this reading. Yeah, okay, we'll stop. We'll finish this section right here. Okay, impact on American culture. Irving popularized the nickname Gotham for New York City, and he is credited with inventing the expression the almighty dollar. Ooh, how many of y'all knew that? I didn't know that. Okay. The surname of his fictional Dutch historian Diederik Knickerbocker is generally associated with New York and New Yorkers, as found in New York's professional basketball team, the New York Knickerbockers. One of Irving's most lasting contributions to American culture is in the way that Americans celebrate Christmas. In his 1812 revisions to A History of New York, he inserted a dream sequence featuring St. Nicholas soaring over treetops in a flying wagon, an invention which others dressed up as Santa Claus. In his Five Christmas Stories in the sketchbook, Irving portrayed an idealized celebration of old-fashioned Christmas customs at a quaint English manner which depicted English Christmas festivals that he experienced while staying in England, which had largely been abandoned. He used texts from The Vindication of Christmas, London 1652, of Old English Christmas traditions, and the book contributed to the revival and reinterpretation of the Christmas holiday in the United States. Irving introduced the erroneous idea that Europeans believed the world to be flat prior to the discovery of the New World in his biography of Christopher Columbus. Yet the flat earth myth has been taught in schools as fact to many generations of Americans. American painter John Quador based many of his paintings on scenes from the works of Irving about Dutch New York, including such paintings as Ichabod Crane flying from the Headless Horseman, 1829, The Return of Rip Van Winkle, 1848, and The Headless Horseman Pursuing Ichabod Crane, 1858. So we'll finish that's concluded there on Wikipedia about the man and how it relates to us here. Because I know y'all done said the almighty dollar. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's get to the reading of this book. I found it interesting that when I was looking at the history of New York, that it started to bring out some of the Dutch history, or reference certain things about the Dutch inside of New York at that time. And one of the things that got me with these books is that they're right around 1808. Okay. That was an interesting date for me as well. So, family, let's get to reading. Okay. Give me a second. All right. So, we're starting on page number 7 of Washington Irving's Works, Volume 1, The Sketchbook Legends of the Conquest of Spain, A Life of Washington Irving. Now, he went over there to write for one of his other books, and he researched for one of his other books, and basically two books came out of this. I don't know how true it's going to be, but let's find out a little bit about his life at least before we get into this. So this is The Life of Washington Irving by Richard Henry Stoddard, and it says this. The life of Washington Irving was one of the brightest ever led by an author. He discovered his genius at an early age, was graciously welcomed by his countrymen, answered the literary condition of the period when he appeared, won easily and as easily kept a distinguished place in the Republic of Letters, was generously rewarded for his work, charmed his contemporaries with his amiability and modesty, lived long, wisely, happily, and died at the ripe old age in the fullness of his powers and his fame. He never learned the mournful truth which the lives of so many authors force upon us, namely, slow rises worth, but poverty depresses. But he never felt the ills which so often assail the souls of scholars, toil, envy, want, the patron, and the jail. He never wrote for his bread like Johnson and Goldsmith, and never hungered like Otway and Chatterton, but lived in learned ease, surrounded by friends, master of himself and his time, a prosperous gentleman. Born under a lucky star, all good things sought him out and was turned by him to delightful uses. He made the world happier by his gifts, and the world honors his memory. Hey, Americal. The ancestry of Washington Irving reaches back to the days of Robert Bruce, who, when a fugitive from the court of Edward I, concealed himself in the house of William de Irwin, his secretary and sword bearer. William de Irvin followed the changing fortunes of his royal master, was with him when he was routed at Methven, shared his subsequent dangers, and was one of the 7 who were hidden with him in a copse of holly when his pursuers passed by. When Bruce came to his own again, he made him master of the rolls, and 10 years after the Battle of Batten, Bannock, Bannockburn, gave him a free barony gave him in free barony the forest of Drum near Aberdeen. My bad, I'm trying to pronounce these words correctly, y'all. It says he also permitted him to use his private badge of 3 holly leaves with the motto Sub sole sub ubre virens, which are still the arms of the Irving family. Our concern, however, is not with the ancestors of Irving, but with his father, William Irving, who was from Shapinsha, 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 one of the Orkney Islands, and who, on the death of his mother, determined to follow the sea. He was born in 1731, a year before Washington, and when his biographers found him, was a petty officer on board of an armed packet ship in the service of his British Majesty, plying between Falmouth and New York. At the former port, he met and became enamored with Sarah Sanders, a beautiful girl about 2 years younger than himself, the only daughter of John and Anna Sanders, the granddaughter of an English curate named Kent. They were married at Falmouth, May 18th, 1761, and 2 years and 2 months later embarked for New York, leaving the body of their first child in an English graveyard. William Irving now abandoned the sea and entered into trade, was prospering in a small way when the Revolution broke out. His house was under the guns of the English ships of war in the harbor, so he concluded to remove to the country and took refuge with his family in Rahway, New Jersey, Rahway. He was safer perhaps than he would have been in New York, but business was at an end. He was pointed out as a rebel, and British troops were billeted in his best rooms while the family was banished to the garret. So he made up his mind to return to New York. He was still a rebel, as well as his wife, who supplied prisoners with food from her own table, visited them in prison when they were ill, and furnished them with clothes, blankets, and the like. Quote, I'd rather you'd send them a rope, Mrs. Irving, end quote, said the brutal Cunningham, who nevertheless allowed her charities to pass through his hands. Washington Irving, the youngest of 11 children and the 8th son of William and Sarah Irving, was born toward the close of those troublesome times in New York on April 3rd, 1783. The house in which he was born, a plain 2-story dwelling on William Street, 131 William Street, between Fulton and John, has long since disappeared, as well as the house on the opposite side of the same street, 128 William Street, to which the family moved within a year after his birth. If the boy differed in any respect from the average boy, the particulars has not reached us. The earliest recorded anecdote in which he figures connects him with the illustrious name of Washington, who entered the city with his army not many months after his birth. The emphasis which greeted the great man was shown by a young Scot maid servant of the family who followed him one morning into a shop, and showing him the lad said, quote, please, your honor, here's a barn, here's a barn was named after you, end quote. He placed his hand on the head of the little namesake and blessed him. And for those of you who didn't catch that last part, there is a picture out here where George Washington is supposedly putting his hand on Washington Irving's head. And the picture that actually that I saw of that, the drawing that saw of that, you notice that all of them had color to a certain extent. You notice that George Washington had color, since people are having this whole conversation about mixed people and all of that. Okay, but let's continue. Um, okay. Master Irving was not a prodigy, for at the first school kept by a woman, to which he was sent in the fourth year, and where he remained upward of 2 years, he learned little beyond his alphabet, and at second, where boys and girls were taught, and where he remained until he was 14. He was more noted for his truth telling than for his scholarship. He distinguished himself while at school by playing the part of Juba in Addison's Cato at a public exposition, and by amusing the audience by struggling at the same time with a mass of honey cake which he was munching behind the scenes when he was suddenly summoned upon the stage. The first book he is known to have read with pleasure was Hull's translation of Orlando Faricio, and Hoole is Hooles or Le, okay, which fired him to imitate or emulate the feats of his heroes by combating with playmates with a wooden sword in the yard of his father's house. His next literary favorite were Robinson Crusoe and Sinbad the Sailor, and a collection of voyages and travels entitled The World Displayed, which he used to read at night by the glimmer of secreted candles after he had retired to bed, and which begot him in which begot in him a desire to go to sea, a strong desire that by the time he left school almost ripened into a determination to run away from home and be a sailor. He led him, I'm sorry, give me a second, you guys. It led him, at any rate, to try to eat salt pork, which he abomined, and to lie on the hard floor, which of course was distasteful to him. These preliminary hardships proved too much for his heroism, so the notion of becoming a gallant tar was reluctantly abandoned. Hmm, gallant tar? Okay. Irving's first known attempt at original composition was a couplet leveled against a larger schoolfellow who was attentive to the servant girl of his master, and who was so enraged at the fun it occasioned that he gave the writer a severe thrashing. The young poet was discouraged in his personalities, but not in his art, for he contributed what is this? Um, metrical, there it is, metrical effusions to the Weekly Museum, a little periodical of 4 pages published in Peck Slip, to which he also contributed moral essays. At the age of 13, he wrote a play which was represented at the house of a friend and stimulated his boyish fondness for the stage. He was abated in his dramatic passion by James K. Paulding, who was between 4 or 5 years his senior and was residing with his brother William Irving, who had married his sister. The theater was situated on John Street between Broadway and not, or yeah, Nassau, um, not far from his father's house, from which he used to steal to see the play, returning in time for the evening prayer, after which he would pretend to retire for the night to his own room in the second story, which he would climb out of the window onto the woodshed to get back to the theater and enjoy the afterpiece. These youthful escapades, if detected, would no doubt have subjected him to a severe lecture from his father, who was a strict, God-fearing man, and to 10 reproaches from his mother. Oh, Washington, sighed the old lady, if you were only good. After a year or two more of school life, during which he acquired the rudiments of a classical education, he concluded to study law, a profession in which his brother John had devoted himself, and accordingly entered the house of Henry Masterton, with whom he remained until the summer of 1801, when he transferred his services to Brockholst, Livingston, and on that gentleman being called to the bench of the Supreme Court of the state in the following January, he continued his legal pursuits in the office of Joshua Odin Hoffman. Why Irving conceived that he had the markings of a lawyer in him, we are not told, nor why his father, who was adverse to law, should have permitted him to mistake his talents. It was not a very dangerous mistake, however, for he soon awoke from it, nor was it sedulously indulged in while it lasted. For when not employed, like Cowper before him, and in giggling and making giggle, he passed his days in reading and belles lettres literature in England, of such literature as America then possessed, which was not much, nor worth dwelling upon now. He found his vocation in his 19th year in the beginning of December 1802, and it was found for him by his brother Peter, who had a couple months before had started a daily paper in New York under the title of Morning Chronicle, of which he was the editor and proprietor, in which he persuaded his clever young brother to assist him. He furnished a series of essays over the signature of Jonathan Oldstyle, which portrayed the bent of his mind in his early readings, and which were generally of a humorous character. They were so much superior to the newspaper writings of the period that he attracted great attention, and in spite of their local and temporary interests, were copied into the journals of other cities. Among those who were struck by their talent was Charles Brockden Brown, who was the first American that made literature. Hold on, you guys. We're on page number 11 here. Who made literature? Got to be careful with these pages. His profession, or a profession. Yeah, a profession. And who had already published four or five novels, remarkable both for their extravagance and their power. He was a contributor to the periodicals of the day, such as they were, of which the best perhaps was the monthly magazine and American Registry, or Register, of which he was the proprietor. It soon died and was followed by the literary magazine and American Register, of which, wait a minute. Did I read that twice? Which proprietor? Okay. Yeah, okay. Proprietor, and it was in this latter capacity, rather than as the first American author, that he visited Irving and besought him to aid him in his new enterprise. It was not successful, for whatever may have been his inclinations, Mr. Jonathan Oldstyle had not yet decided upon being an author. Irving's love of adventure, which had been stimulated by the reading of voyages and travels, and which would have led him to follow the maritime life if he could have gratified his inclinations, expended itself in long rambles about the rural neighborhoods of the city, which he knew by heart, and in more distant excursions into the country. He spent a holiday in Westchester County in his 15th year and explored the recesses of Sleepy Hollow, and in his 17th year made a voyage up the Hudson, the beauties of which, as Bryant has pointed out, he was the first to describe. He also greatly impressed he was great I'm sorry. He was greatly impressed by the sight of the highlands, crowned with forest, with eagles sailing and screaming around them, and unseen streams dashing down their precipices, and was fairly bewitched by the Catskill Mountains. Quote, never shall I forget, he wrote, the effect upon me of the first view of them predominating over the wide extent of country, partly wild, woody, and rugged, part softened away into all the graces of cultivation. As we slowly floated along, I lay on the deck and watched them through a long summer day, undergoing 1,000 mutations under the magical effects of atmosphere, sometimes seeming to approach and other times to recede, now almost melting into the hazy distance, now varnished or burnished by the setting sun, until, in the evening, they printed themselves against the glowing sky in the deep purple of an Italian landscape. End quote. In his 20th year, he made a visit to Johnstown, the residence of his elder sister, which he reached by wagon after a voyage by sloop to Albany. This visit seems to have been undertaken on account of his health, for he was troubled with the constant pain in his breast and an harassing cough at night. Quote, I have been unwell almost all the time I have been up here, end quote, he wrote to a friend. I am too weak to take any exercise and too low spirited half the time to enjoy company. Was that young Irvin? Asked Judge Kent of his brother-in-law, who slept in the room next to me and kept up such an insistent cough during the night. It was. He was not long for this world. The lugubrious judgment of the great jurist was shared by the family of Irving, who determined to send him to Europe. The expense was mainly borne by his brother William, who told him, speaking in behalf of his relatives, that one of their greatest sources of happiness was that fortune put it in their power to add to the comfort and happiness of one so dear to them. They accordingly secured a passage for him to Bordeaux, for which he started on the 19th of May, 1804. Quote, there's a chap, said the captain, who will go overboard before we get across. End quote. The first European visit of an American was a greater event 70 years ago than it is today. It was less common, at any rate, and was attended with dangers which no longer exist. What it was to Irving, we gather from his letters, which may still be read with pleasure, though nothing like the pleasure that afforded his friends who were more interested in his itinerary than it is possible for us to be. He reached Bordeaux after what the sailor calls a lady's voyage, much improved in health and enough of a sailor to climb to the masthead and go out on the main topsail yard. He remained at Bordeaux about 6 weeks, seeing what there was to see, and studied to improve himself in the language. From Bordeaux, he proceeded to Marsalis by diligence and accompanied an eccentric American doctor who pretended that Irving was an English prisoner whom a young French officer that was with them had in custody, much to the regret of some girls in Tunis who pitied, let me see if I can say this, les pervers garçons. I think that's the way that's pronounced. And his prospect of losing his head, and supplied him with a bottle of wine of which they would not take any recompense. At Nesmes, he began to have misgivings about his passports, of which he had two, neither accurate, his eyes being described as blue in one and gray in the other. He had a great deal of trouble with his passports, first and last, but he worried through it, and considerable loss of temper. I'm sorry, he worried through it with the considerable loss of temper, and after a detention in Nice, finally set sail in the felucca of Genoa. From Genoa, where he resided upward of 2 months, he started for Messina, failing in which, sorry, y'all good? Y'all good? Y'all still here? Okay, I'm getting it. I'm getting it. Hold on, I'm unfamiliar. A lot of places here. From Genoa, where he resided upward for 2 months, he started for Messina, falling in with a privateer or pirate on the way, who frightened the captain and crew, and relieved them of about half their provisions, besides some of their furniture and a watch and some clothes out of the trunks of the passengers. From Genoa, he proceeded to Syracuse, where he explored this celebrated Ear of Dionysus and set out with a party for Catania, and thence to Palermo, sorry about that, where he arrived at the latter end of the carnival. He reached Naples on March 7th, 1805, and after resting a few days, made a night ascent of Mount Vesuvius, where he had a tremendous view of the crater that poured out a stream of red hot lava, the sulphurous smoke of which stifled him, so much so that but for the shifting of the wind he might have shared in the fate of Pliny. 20 days later, he entered Rome by the Lateran Gate. Here he met a fellow countryman in the person of Washington Alston, who was about 4 years his elder, whose taste for art had been awakened at Newport by his association with Malbone, the famous miniature painter, and who was already more than a painter of promise. Quote, I don't think, Irving wrote years after, that I have ever been more captivated. I'm sorry, that I have been more completely captivated on a first acquaintance. He was of a light and graceful form, with large blue eyes and black silky hair, waving and curly round a pale, expressive countenance. Everything about him bespoke the man of intellect and refinement. His conversation was copious, animated, and highly graphic, warmed by genial sensibility and benevolence, and enlivened by chaste and gentle humor. End quote. Irving and Austin fraternized and spent the 22nd birthday of the former in seeing some of the finest collections of paintings in Rome. The painting the painter teaching the traveler how to visit them to the most advantage, teaching them how to visit them to the most advantage, leaving him always to the masterpieces and passing the others without notice. They rambled in company about the eternal city and its environs, and Irving contrasted their different pursuits and prospects, favoring as he did so those of Aston, who was to reside amid the delightful scenes among which they were surrounded by famous works of art and classic and history monuments, and by men of congenial taste, while he was to return home to the dry study of law, for which he had no relish and, as he feared, no talent. Quote, why might I not remain here and be a painter, end quote, he thought. And he mentioned the idea to his friends, who caught it with eagerness. They would take an apartment together and he would give him all the instruction and assistance in his power. But it was not to be. Their lots in life were differently cast. So Irving resigned the transient but delightful prospect of becoming a painter. During his sojourn in Rome, he attended the conversions of Torloni, the banker, who treated him with great distinction, and calling him aside when he came to make his adieu, asked him in French if he was not a relative of General Washington. He was also introduced to the Baron de Holbert or Humboldt, minister of Prussia to the court of Rome, and brother to the celebrated traveler and savant to the Madame de Stael, who astounded him by the astonishing flow of her conversation and the multitude of questions with which she plied him. Irving started for Paris on the 11th of April and reached it on the 24th of May. His stay in Paris, which extended over 4 months, was a round and of sightseeing and amusement. One night he went to the theater uh, Montansier, where the acting was humorous but rather gross. Another night he went to the Imperial Academy of Music, where he saw the opera of Aceste, or opera of Aceste or Aceste. A third night he went to the theater of Jeunesse Artiste, where boys acted plays, and a fourth to the theater of Port St. Martin. He made the acquaintance at this time of another American painter, Vanderleen, a man of genius in whom he was much interested and whom made a sketch of him in crayons. His mental improvement was not neglected in the gay capital, for he bought a botanical dictionary and took 2 months' tuition in French. Okay. Irving arrived in London on the 8th of October after a tour through the Netherlands. He found lodging to his liking in Norfolk Street, Strad, not far from the city, and being in the vicinity of the theaters, he devoted most of his evenings to visiting them. Three great actors were then playing: John Kemble, Cook, and Mrs. Siddons. And in his correspondence with his brother William, he described the impression they made on him. Kemble was a very studied actor, he thought. His performance his performances were correct and highly finished paintings, but much labored. He never led the spectators to forget him in Othello. It was Kendall who saw throughout, not the jealous Moor. Mm. He was cold, artificial, and unequal, and he wanted mellowness in the tender scenes. He was fine in passages when he played Jaffier, but great only in Zanga, whom for the moment he fancied himself. Cook was next to him, though rather confined in his range. His Iago was admirable. His Richard was told his Richard, he was told, was equally good, and in Sir Peretinix McPsychophant he left nothing to be desired. But Mrs. Siddons, if he wrote what he thought of her, his praises would be thought exaggerated. Quote, her looks, her voice, her gestures delighted me. She penetrated in a moment to my heart. She froze and melted it by turns. A glance of her eye, a start, an, an exclamation thrilled through my very frame. The more I see her, the more I admire her. I hardly breathe while she is on stage. She works up my feelings till I am like a mere child. End quote. Irving set out from Gravesend on the 18th of January 1806 and reached New York after a stormy passage of 64 days. He had contradicted the prophecy of the captain with whom he originally sailed that he would go overboard before he got across, and of George Kent, who declared he was not longer for this world, or not long for this world. He returned in good health and resumed his legal studies, which were advanced enough to enable him to pass an examination in the ensuing November, which ended in his admission to the bar. He entered the office of his brother John at number 3 Wall Street, and while waiting for clients who never came, he turned his attention to literature more seriously than he had ever done before. There was more room in it than in the overcrowded profession of the law. So much room, indeed, that the young man of his talents might do almost anything that he chose. There was no fear of competitors at any rate, for authorship as a craft had no followers except Charles Breckton Brown, who was still editing the literary magazine, and perhaps John Denny, whose reputation, such as it was, rested on his lay preacher, and who was editing the portfolio. The few poets of which America boasted were silent. Trumbull, the author of McFingal, which was published the year before Irving's birth, was a judge of the Superior Court. Dwight, whose Conquest of Canaan was published 3 years later, was merely the president of Yale College. Barlow, whose Visions of Columbus was published 2 years later still, and who had returned to this country after shining abroad as a diplomatist, was living in splendor on the banks of the Potomac and brooding over that unreadable poem, which he expanded into an epic of the Columbiad. And Fresnel, by all odds, the best of the early versifiers, who had published a collection of his effusions, in 1795, had abandoned the Muses and was sailing a sloop between Savannah, Charleston, and the West Indies. Pierpont, who was 2 years younger than Irving, was a private tutor in South Carolina. Dana was a student at Harvard, and Bryant, a youth of 12 at Cummington, was scribbling juvenile poems which were being published in a newspaper in Northampton. It's kind of interesting, y'all. The library of Irving's father was rich in Elizabethan writers, among whom Chaucer and Spenser were his early favorites, and it contained the classics of the 18th century in verse and prose, not forgetting The Spectator and Tatler and Rambler, and the works of the ingenious Dr. Goldsmith. Everybody who read fiction was familiar with the novels of Fielding and Smollett, and lovers of political literature were familiar with the speeches of Burke and the letters of Junius. Everybody read or could read the the poetical works of Cowper and Burns, Campbell's Pleasures of Hope, and Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel, and whatever else in the shape of verse American publishers thought it worth their while to reprint for them. For then, as now, they were willing to enlighten their countrymen at the expense of the British authors. Equipped with a liberal education, which he had imbibed from English literature, and with the practice which he had gained in writing for the paper of his brother Peter, which was discontinued shortly before his return to America, Irving cast about for a field of authorship in which he might safely venture. His inclination was toward the writing of essays in which he had had considerable experience, and the taste of his friend Paulding, who was still living under the roof of his brother William, was in the same direction. They put their heads together and sketched out a plan of publication in which ha- they might have their fling at men and things, and which should come out in numbers whenever it suited their pleasure or convenience. The title that they selected was Salmagundi, which is derived from the French word salmagundis, which is made up of two Latin words, salgama and condita, signifying preserved pickles. It now means a salad. But anyway, Johnson defines the word as a mixture of chopped meats and pickled herring with olive oil, vinegar, pepper, and onions, which no doubt is an appetizing dish when one has become accustomed to it. Irving and Paulding were joined by William Irving, and the three resolved themselves into what the Spaniards call a junta, i.e., Lancelot Langstaff, Anthony Evergreen, and William Wizard. The first number of Salmagundi was issued, the first number of Salmagundi was issued on January 24th, 1807, the last on January 25th, 1808. The 20 numbers of which it consisted covered just the true love epic of the old ballads. Quote, a 12-month and a day, end quote. The time, which was ripe for almost anything in the shape of American literature, was so propitious for a periodical of this kind that the success of the first number was decisive. There was no home literature then to speak of, as I have already hinted, and the city in which this bright venture appeared was a mere town compared to the Babel of today, scarcely numbering 80,000 inhabitants. It was not difficult to make a sensation in a place of that size, in a barren literary period, and Salmagundi certainly made a great one. Everybody talked about it and wondered who its writers could be, and nobody was much the wiser for his wonderment, for the secret was well kept. It would be idle now to attempt to distinguish the share of the different writers. For, as Paulding wrote afterwards in the uniform edition of his work in which it was included, quote, the thoughts of the authors were often so mingled together in these essays, and they were so literally joint productions that it would be difficult as well as useless to assign each his exact share, end quote. Authors there were none in New York, with the exception of the authors of Salmagundi, though there was no lack of writers so called, among whom figured Samuel Latham Mitchell with with two I's, practicer of physics, like his friend, like Johnson's friend Levet, lawyer and retired Indian commissioner, member of Congress, and of various learned societies, and editor of the Medical Repository. This gentleman, who wrote largely and was a butt of the wits of the day, had lately published A Picture of New York, which, if not funny itself, was a source of fun to others, particularly to Irving and his brother Peter, who determined to burlesque it. With this object in view, they made many notes, and not to be behind its erudite author, who began his work with an account of the Aborigines, they began theirs with the creation of the world. Started shortly after the publication of Salmagundi, it proceeded slowly and with some interruptions until the following January, when Peter Irving departed for Liverpool on urgent business. Left to himself, his forsaken collaborator changed the whole plan of the work, condensing the great mass of notes which they had accumulated into 5 introductory chapters and commencing at the considerably larger period. I'm sorry, let me say that again. Left to himself, his forsaken collaborator changed the whole plan of the work, condensing the great mass of notes which they had accumulated into 5 introductory chapters, and commencing at a considerably later period, the new genesis being the dynasty of the Dutch in New York. Laid aside for a time, he resumed it in the summer at the country house at Ravenswood near Hellgate, whither he had retired in where whither he had retired in order to prepare it for the press. The stupendous hoax, a stupendous hoax, it was launched with a series of small hoaxes, the first of which appeared in the Evening Post of October 25th, 1809, in the shape of a paragraph narrating the disappearance from his lodging of a small elderly gentleman by the name of Knickerbocker. He was mm, he was stated to be dressed in an old black coat and a cocked hat, and it was intimated that there were some reasons for believing that he was not in his right mind. Great anxiety was felt, and any information concerning him would be thankfully received at the Columbian Hotel, Mulberry Street, and at the office of the paper. This feeler was followed in a week or two by a communication from a traveler who professed from a, um, from a traveler who professed to have seen him some weeks before by the side of the road a little above Kingsbridge. Quote, he had in his hands a small bundle tied in a red bandana handkerchief. He appeared to be traveling northward and was very much fatigued and exhausted, end quote. 10 days later, November 6th, Mr. Seth Handaside, landlord of the independent Columbian Hotel, inserted a card in the same paper in which he declared that there had been found in the room of the missing man, Dr. Dietrich Knickerbocker, a curious kind of a written book in his own handwriting, and he wished the editor to notify him if he was alive, that if he did not return and pay off the bill for board, he would have disposed of his book to satisfy him for the same. The bait took, so much so that one of the city authorities actually waited upon Irving's brother John and consulted him on the propriety of offering a reward for the mythical Dietrich. To these puffs preliminary was added the precaution of having the manuscript set up in Philadelphia, which lessened the danger of the real character of the work being discovered before its appearance. The History of New York was which was published in this city on the 6th of December 1809 was a success in more ways than one. Its whim and satire amused the lovers of wit and humor, and its irrelevance toward the early Dutch settlers of the state annoyed and angered their descendants. Between those two classes of readers, it was much talked about and largely circulated. The monthly anthology, the forerunner of the North American Review, pronounced it the wittiest book our press has ever produced, and Scott, to whom the copy of the second edition was sent by Irving's friend Henry Brevoort, and upon whom, from his ignorance of American parties and politics, much of it concealed satire was lost, owned that looking at the simple, I'm sorry, owned that, looking at its simple and obvious meaning only, he had never read anything so closely resembling the style of Dean Swift as the Annals of Dietrich Knickerbocker. Brian, who was a youth at college when it came out, committed a portion of it to memory to repeat as the declamation before his class, but was so overcome with laughter when he appeared on the floor. When he appeared on the floor, that he was unable to proceed, and drew upon himself the rebuke of his tutor. 50 years later, when he delivered a discourse on the life, character, and genius of Irving, his admiration had not subsided. Quote, "When I compare it to other works of wit and humor of a similar strength," he said, "I find that unlike most of them, it carries the reader to the conclusion without weariness or satire. So unsought, spontaneous, self-suggested are the wit and the humor. The author makes us laugh because he can no more help it than we can help laughing." He re- and that's the end quote. He refers to the opinion of Scott already quoted and remarks that the rich vein of Irving was of the quality quite distinct from the dry drollery of Swift, and he detected the influence of his reading. Quote, "I find in this work more traces than in his other writings, and of what Irving owed to the earlier authors in our language. The quaint poetic coloring and often the phraseology betray the disciple of Chaucer and Spenser. We are conscious of a flavor of an olden time as of a racy wine of some rich vintage. Quote, cooled a long age in the deep delved earth." End quote. I would not say that there are no passages in this work which are not worthy of their context, that we do not sometimes meet with phraseology which we could wish changed, that the wit does not sometimes run wild and drop here and there a jest which we could willingly spare. We forgive, we overlook, we forget all this as we read in consideration of the entertainment we have enjoyed and of which beckons inter, um, beckons us forward on the next page of our I'm sorry of all mocked of all mock heroic works, Knickerbocker's History of New York is the gayest, the airiest, and the least tiresome. Yeah, it was good reading the beginning of that. I'm be honest with y'all. Um, it kept me entertained. I didn't read too much of it, probably about 17 pages of it or so. Let's continue. Irving's next literary labor was the editorship of a monthly publication which had been established in Philadelphia, and which, from its title, Select Reviews, would appear to have been an eclectic character. Its name was changed to the An Eclectic magazine during his management, which extended through the years of 1813 and 1814, and it bade fair to be successful until its proprietor was ruined by the failure of the New York publishers of Salmagundi. Irving's contributions to this dead and gone old periodical consisted of critical notes of new works by English and American authors, among others, one by his friend Paulding, who had dropped into poetry with a Lay of the Scottish Fiddle, of a series of biographies of the naval heroes of our second war with England, and of a revised and enlarged memoir of the poet Campbell, which he had written at the request of his brother a year or two before, to accompany an American edition of his poetic works. Irving signed off what was owing to him, and peace with England being declared shortly after, he departed for Europe for the second time on the 25th of May, 1815. He was a partner in a mercantile house which his brother Peter and Ebenezer had started in Liverpool, and it was quite as much to assist the former, who was of ill health, as to divert himself, that he undertook the journey. He remained at Liverpool for some time, examining the affairs of P&E, Irving and Company, which had fallen into confusion on account of the sickness of his brother and the death of his principal clerk, mastering details and learning bookkeeping in order to straighten out their books. The business of the Irving brothers ended in failure owing to the variety of causes which there is no occasion to specify here, and the literary members of the firm turned his attention again to the only business for which he was really fitted. He had renewed his acquaintance with Alston, who was now residing in London, and had met Leslie, the artist, both of whom were making designs for a new edition of his History of New York. The summer of 1817 found Irving in London, which he paid a visit to Campbell at Sydenham, um, Sydenham, who was simmering over his specimen of the English poets, and where he dined with Murray. I'm sorry, y'all, my glasses give me problems right here. Um, and where he dined with Murray, the bookseller, who showed him a long letter from Byron, who was in Italy and was engaged on the fourth canto of Chalet Harold, and it looks like child with a D on with an E on the end. So Child Harold, put it that way, or Chalet Harold, and who had told him that he was much happier after breaking with Lady Baron, or I'm sorry, Lady Byron. Um, he hated this still quiet life. From London he proceeded to Edinburgh, whence he walked out to a mansion which had been taken by Geoffrey, with whom he dined, after which he rattled off by the mail coach in Falkirk, and by chaise to Melrose. On his way to the latter place he stopped at the gate of Abbotsford, and sent in his letter of introduction to Scott. The glorious old minstrel himself came hobbling to the gate, and took him by hand in a way that made him feel as if they were old friends. In a moment he was seated at the hospitable board among his charming family. He passed 2 days at Albertsford, rambling about the hills with his host, and visiting the haunts of Thomas the Rhymer, and other spots rendered classic by border tale and song, in a kind of dream. He was delighted with the character and manners of the great man, and it was a constant source of pleasure to him to watch his deportment toward his family, his neighbors, his domestics, his very dogs and cats. Quote, "It is a perfect picture to see Scott and his household assembled of every evening, the dog stretched before the fire, the cat perched on the chair, Mrs. Scott and the girls sewing, and Scott either reading out of some old romance or telling border stories. Our amusements were occasionally diversified by a border song from Sophia, who is as well versed in border minstrelsy as her father." End quote. This pilgrimage to Albertsford, which is described at length in the fifth volume of Lockhart's Life of Scott, was brought about by Campbell. When you see the Tom, when you see Tom Campbell, Scott wrote to one of his friends, tell him with my best love that I have to thank him for making me known to Mr. Washington Irving, who is one of the best and pleasant acquaintances I have made to this many a day. Y'all good? I see y'all still in here. Okay. We're on page 24. Hope you guys are enjoying the reading. I am. I know that much. Okay. Um, to continue. The house of the Irving brothers succeeded so ill in England that the two resident partners, Peter and Washington, finally made up their minds to go into bankruptcy. The necessary proceedings occupied some months, during which time the latter shut himself up from society and studied German day and night, partly in the hope that it would be of some service to him and partly to keep off uncomfortable thoughts. His brother William, who was in Congress, had exerted himself to have him made Secretary of Legation at the court of St. James, but in vain, and his friend, Commodore Decanter, who kept a place for him in the Navy Board, the salary of which would enable him to live in Washington like a prince, he concluded not to accept it, however greatly to the chagrin of his brothers, but to remain abroad and battle with fortune on his own accord or account. So he went up to London again in the summer of 1818 to see if he could not live by his pen. Nearly 9 years have elapsed since the publication of the History of New York, and with the exception of his reviews and biographies of the eclectic magazine, he had written nothing. His mercantile connections with his brothers had proved disastrous to them as well as to himself, and he was now dependent on his own exertions. If there is anything in experience that fits one of the literature, he was better fitted for it than ever before. He had passed through the troubles, I'm sorry, he had passed through troubles which had deepened his knowledge of life, having lost his father, who died shortly before the completion of Salmagundi, and his mother, who died about 10 years later and whose death was still fresh in his memory. Between these two sorrows came the tragedy which darkened his young manhood and was never forgotten, the death of Matilda Hoffman, the young lady to whom he was attached, who closed her brief existence at the age of 18 while he was composing the amusing annals of Mr. Dietrich Knickerbocker. He was a bold American who would dare to attempt. Sorry, you guys, hold on. He was a bold American who would dare to attempt at that time to live by authorship in his own country, which he had known but one professional author, Charles Brockman Brown, who had died about 8 years before and at the early age of 39. But he was a bolder American who would dare to attempt the same hazardous feat in England. Such a man was Irving, who settled down in London in his 36th year to see if he could earn a living by his pen. His capital was the practice he already possessed, and some unfinished sketches upon which he had been engaged, precisely when and where we are not told. He set to work on these sketches with the intention of issuing them in numbers as a periodical publication. And when he had finished enough to make the first number, he dispatched the manuscript across the Atlantic to his brother Ebenezer in February 1819. He was put to press under the title The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, and published in May simultaneously in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. It contains 6 papers or sketches, of which the perennial Rip Van Winkle soon became a general favorite. There was an immediate demand for the sketchbook, for as one of Irving's critics observed, sorry, that thing is kicking in. There was an immediate demand for the sketchbook, for as one of Irving's critics observed, the honor of our national literature was so associated with his name that the pride as well as the better feelings of his countrymen were interested in accumulating the gifts of his genius. He was congratulated on resuming the pen in the anti-eclectic, but ana-eclectic, or analectic, if you put it that way, by his friend Gulian C. Verplanck, who, by the way, had not taken kindly to his Knickerbocker, who saw in every page his rich and sometimes extravagant humor, his gay and graceful fancy, his peculiar choice and felicity of original expression, as well as the pure and fine moral feeling which imperceptibly pervaded every thought and image. The second number of which, furnished before the publication of the first, was enriched by the exquisite paper on rural life in England and the pathetic story of the broken heart by Richard Henry Donna. I'm sorry, Mr. Richard Henry Donna wrote of the former in the North American Review that it left its readers as restored and cheerful as if it had been passing an hour or two in the very fields and woods themselves, and that his scenery was so true, so full of little beautiful peculiars, and so varied and yet so connected in character that distant the distant was brought nigh, and the whole was seen and felt like a delightful reality. A copy of this number was placed by one of Irving's friends in the hands of William Godwin, the famous author of Caleb Williams, who found everywhere in it the marks of a mind of the uttermost eloquence and refinement, a thing you know that he was not exactly prepared to look for in an American, and he was pleased to say that he scarcely knew an Englishman who could have written it. Another Englishman was of some gracious opinion in this illustrious novelist, Mr. William Jerdan, Jerdan, the editor of the London Literary Gazette, who began to reprint the first number of the sketchbook in his periodical, which was somehow regarded as an authority in literature. A copy of the third number, which was published in America in September, reached England and came into the possession of a London publisher who was considered the propriety of bringing out the whole work. This determined Irving to revise the numbers he had already published, that they might at least come before the English public correctly, and he accordingly took them to Murray, with whom he left them for examination, stating that he had materials on hand for the second volume. The great man declined the engagement of their publication because he did not see, quote, that scope in the nature of it to make satisfactory accounts, end quote, between them. But he offered to do what he could to promote their circulation and was ready to attend to any future plan of his. Irving then bethought himself of Scott, to whom he sent the printed numbers with a letter, in which he observed that a reverse had taken place in his affairs since he had the pleasure of enjoying his hospitality, which made the exercise of his pen important to him. He soon received a reply from Scott, who spoke very highly of his talents and offered him the authorship of an anti-Jacobean periodical, which had been projected at Edinburgh, the salary of which would be £500 a year certain, with a reasonable prospect of future advantages. When the parcel reached him, as it did at Edinburgh, he added in a postscript, quote, I am just here and have glanced over the sketchbook. It is positively beautiful and increases my desire to crimp you if possible, end quote. Irving immediately declined the editorship proposed to him, feeling peculiarly unfitted for the post and being as useless for regular service as one of his country Indians or a Don Cusack. Having by this time concluded to print the book at his own risk, he found no difficulty in finding a publisher who was unlucky enough to fail just as it was getting into fair circulation. Scott came up to London at this junction for the purpose of receiving his baronetcy, and he called upon Murray, who now saw, quote, that scope in the nature, end quote, of the sketchbook, which it had lacked before, and who printed an edition of the first volume and put the second volume to press, and so became Irving's publisher. The sketchbook put 400 pounds in the pocket of Irving and made him famous. Jeffrey wrote of it in the Edinburgh Review that he had seldom seen a work that gave him a more pleasing impression of the writer's character, or a more favorable one in his judgment and taste. Lockhart declared in Blackwood that Mr. Washington Irving is one of our first favorites among the English writers of this age, and he is not a bit the less so for being born in America. And Mrs. Siddons gave it the seal of her authority and intimidated Irving when she was introduced to him by saying in her most tragic way, quote, "You've made me weep," um, end quote. Byron, who read all the new works of the time with avidity, wrote to his and Irving's publisher Murray, quote, "Karen is very good, and shortly, is that it? Okay, I'm sorry, Crayon, Crayon is very good." And shortly before his death, waxed eloquent in his words, praising to the young American who had called upon him and who, at his request, had brought him a copy of the sketchbook. Quote, "I handed it to him when, seizing it with enthusiasm, he turned to the broken heart," end quote. That is, he said, still quoting some shit. I don't know how far this quote goes. A bunch of quotation marks around here. Anyway, let me just read. Okay, let me try to go again. "I handed it to him when, seizing it with enthusiasm, he turned to the broken heart. That is, he said, is one of the finest things ever written on earth, and I want to hear an American read it. By stay, do you know Irving?" I replied that I had never seen him. "God bless him," exclaimed Byron. "He's a genius, and he has something better than genius, a heart. I wish I could see him, but I fear I never shall." Well read, The Broken Heart. Yes, The Broken Heart. What a word. In closing the first paragraph, I said, "Shall I confess it? I do believe in broken hearts." "Yes," exclaimed Byron, "and so do I, and so does everybody but philosophers and fools." While I was reading one of the most touching portions of the mournful piece, I observed that Byron wept. He turned his eyes upon me and said, "You see me weep, sir?" Iron, Irving himself never wrote that story without weeping, nor can I hear it without tears. I have never wept so much in this world, for trouble never brings tears to my eyes, but I always have tears for the broken heart, end quote. He concluded by praising the verses of Moore, Moore, okay. He concluded by praising the verses of Moore at the end of the story and asking if there were many such men as Irving in America. "God don't send many such spirits in this world," end quote. The lives of authors are not often interesting apart from the light in which they shed upon their writings, and the life of Irving was not, I think, an exception to the rule. What it was hitherto has we have seen, and what it was hereafter I shall show, though not in its details, which were neither striking nor important. 5 years had now elapsed since he left America, and 12 more years were to elapse before he returned to it. He had published his third book and had made a name for himself in England. In other words, he had found his true vocation, and it would be his own fault if he did not pursue it with honor and profit. The summer of 1820 found him in Paris with his brother Peter, and before the close of the year he had made the acquaintance of Moore, the poet, who was sporting in exile in France, while his friends were starting to settle a claim which the English government had against him on account of the defalcation of the deputy who had filed in his place, the officer of registrar of Admiralty Court in Bermuda, to which he had been appointed about 17 years before. Let me read that again because there's probably some details in there. The summer of 1820 found him in Paris with his brother Peter, and before the close of the year, he had made the acquaintance of Moore the poet, who was sporting in exile in France, while his friends were trying to settle a claim which the English government had against him on account of the defalcation of the deputy who had filled in his place the office of registrar of the Admiralty Court of Bermuda, to which he had been appointed about 17 years before. Moore jotted down the diary that they met at the table of de Haut at Maurice's, the most expensive hotel in Paris, and that the successful author was a good-looking and intelligent-mannered man. 7 days later, they met at Moore's College in the Champs um, Elysees, and scarcely a day passed without their seeing each other. Moore had tried to work now on his life of Sheridan. Hold on a second. Moore was trying to work now on his life of Sheridan and now on an Egyptian romance, but it was the merest pretense, as his diary bears witness, for he notes in one entry that he had been no less than 5 weeks in writing 192 lines of verse, and in another, when he thought he had been more industrious, that he had written nearly 50 lines in a week. The fertility of Irving, who wrote with ease when he could write at all, astonished him. Irving called near dinner time, he wrote on March 19th, 1821, asked him to stay and share our roast chicken with us, which he did. He has been hard at work writing lately. In the course of 10 days, he has written about 130 pages of the size of those in the sketchbook. This is amazing rapidity. Y'all good? Another writer was in exile in France at this time, a fellow townsman of Irving, John Howard Payne, who had taken the critics of New York by storm when he played young Noval at the Park Theater, who had gone to England about 2 years before Irving, where he became a dramatic author with some success and a manager with none at all, and who is now chiefly remembered by the song of Home Sweet Home. Home Sweet Home. Okay. London growing too small for him, he escaped to Paris, where Irving breakfast, 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 breakfasted, breakfasted with him, after which they paid a visit to Talma together, Talma. A whim for traveling which frequently seized him sent Irving back to London in the summer of 1821 with no definite object in view, unless it was to see his friends and the approaching coronation of George IV. He was fortunate enough to witness the procession from a stand on the outside of Westminster Abbey and to meet with Scott, who told him that he should have seen it from within the Abbey, which he might easily have done, as his name would have got him in anywhere. He brought over with him a petite comedy of Payne's, with the ominous title of The Borrower, and made a fruitless attempt to have it produced on the stage. He also brought over the manuscript of a new book, his speed in writing which had so amazed Moore, and worked upon it when he was in the humor. Okay. When it was finished, which was not until the following winter, he was waited upon by Colburn, the publisher, with a letter of introduction from Campbell and an offer of 1,000 guineas. He was not inclined to leave Murray, who had treated him very handsomely and was anxious to publish another book for him. Irving named the price he wished, 1,500 guineas, which rather staggered the prince of the booksellers. Quote, "If you had said 1,000 guineas," he began, "you shall have had it for 1,000 guineas," replied Irving, and the bargain was complete. Okay. Concerning Irving's fourth book, Bracebridge Hall, Okay, so this must be one of the volumes that's missing in this set. Okay. Concerning Irving's fourth book, Bracebridge Hall, which was published in England and America in May 1832, critical opinions differ. The North American Review for July, speaking in the person of Mr. Edward Everett, its editor, had no hesitation in pronouncing it equal to anything which the then age of English literature had produced in the department of essay writing, and praised it for its admirable sketches of life and manners, highly curious in themselves and rendered almost important by the good-natured mock gravity, the ironic, ironical reverence, and lively wit with which they were described. Jeffrey recognized the singular sweetness of the composition and the mildness of the sentiments, but thought the rhythm and melody of the sentences excessive, in that they wore an air of mannerism and created an impression of the labor that must have been bestowed upon what was but a secondary attribute of good writing. Wearied by the wearied by his London life, Irving started on a tour on the continent, which lasted about a month, and which finally brought up at Paris. He was not in trim for composition when he settled down again, but was haunted by the dread of future failures, a kind of nervous horror which frequently overpowered him. His poetic friend Moore had returned to England, where he had been delivered of his loves of the angels by his dramatic friend Payne, um, was still in exile in Paris. Let me read that again. His poetic friend Moore had returned to England, where he had been delivered of his loves of the angels, but his dramatic friend Payne was still in exile in Paris and was the tenant of two residences, one of which in the Rue Richelieu he rented to Irving. He succeeded in persuading Irving to join him in his dramatic undertakings, one of which already far advanced was Les Jeunesses de Rochelieu, a French play which had been acted um, which which had been acted about 30 years before. They were to divide the profits, if there were any, and Irving's share in the projected manufactures was to be kept secret. They must have worked with great rapidity, for in addition to the play they mentioned, they completed a translation of another entitled Azuda, or Azende, my bad, Azende, which was intended to be set to music, besides two others, Bells and Bailiffs, and Married and Single. Um, Not forgetting Abdul Hassan, a German opera which Irving had done into English at Dresden. Laden with these publications, Payne set off privately for London, for which he was disbarred. Sorry, you guys, hold on. Laden with these publications, Payne set off privately for London, from which he was debarred by his creditors, and put himself in communication with Charles Kimball. While he was undergoing the delayed incident to acceptance or rejection, Irving transmitted to him the manuscript of Charles II, or The Merry Monarch, the three-act comedy from the French of Les Jeunesses de Henry V, of which, as far as I can understand, he was nearly, if not quite, the sole author or adapter. I was sold by Payne to convert to Covent Garden Theatre for 200 guineas, together with Les Jeunesses de Rochelieu, and was produced in the following spring, May 1824, with great success. The Les Jeunesses de Rochelieu Sorry, y'all, I'm trying to get it. Was produced nearly 2 years later and withdrawn after a few nights. Y'all still here? I must be doing okay. All right, let's read some more. And we are on page 32. I hope this reading is not too slow for you guys. Trying to do my best here. Let's just see. Okay, okay, okay. You said not bad French. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Literary activity returned to Irving during this curious dramatic episode in his career, stimulated no doubt by a letter from Murray, who asked him what he might expect from him in the course of the winter. He replied that he should probably have two more volumes of the sketchbook ready by spring, and began to write the story of Walford Weber, Walford Weber, which he soon laid aside. His journal chronicles the progress of his labor, which proceeded at a rapid rate, in spite of his dining outs, hastening perhaps by the title which he found for his New York Tales of a Traveler. Okay, and that's one of the volumes that's in here too. Give me a second, y'all. I need to um, drink a little something, something, and clear my throat a little bit. So give me a little break right here, okay? I'll be right back. All right, family, I'm back. I'm gonna start that paragraph over again. I lost my page too, so but I have found it. We were on page 32. I'm glad I called it out. So, page 32, second paragraph. Literary activity returned to Irving during his curious dramatic episode in his career, stimulated no doubt by the letter from Murray, who asked him what he might expect from him in the course of the winter. He replied that he should probably have two more volumes of the sketchbook ready by spring, and began to write the story of Walford Weber, which he soon laid aside. His journal chronicles the progress of his labor, which proceeded at a rapid rate, in spite of his dining outs, hastened perhaps by the title which he found for his New York Tales of a Traveler, and by Murray's offering 1,200 guineas for it without seeing the manuscript. When it was finished, he took it over to London, where he met Murray, who behaved like a gentleman, i.e., gave him 1,500 guinea for it, as well as several celebrities, including William Spencer, Proctor, Rogers, and more, the last of whom went with him to Bowood, the seat of Lord Lansdowne. Mm, okay. He was not a he was not brilliant as a conversationalist at this time. Whatever he may have been later, for more notes in his diary that at two dinners which he mentions, he was sleepy and did not open his mouth, and adds curtly, not strong as a lion, but delightful as a domestic animal. The Tales of a Traveler appear in two volumes in England and in America in four parts. It sold well in the former country, but it can hardly be said to have been literary success in either, especially in the latter, where the press were hostile to it. Wilson, speaking through the mouth of Timothy Tickler, in Blackwood, said, I have been terribly disappointed in the Tales of a Traveler, and the reviewer of the London Quarterly, through his praise, though he praises the story of Buckthorn, from which he thought it probable that he might as a novelist prove no contemptible rival to Goldsmith, warns him that he must in future be true to his own reputation throughout, and correct the habits of indolence which so considerably a part of his work invents. Irving's next intellectual labor after his return to France was a planning of a series of papers, the proper execution of which demanded, I think, a weightier pen than he possessed, consisting as it did of serious essays upon American manners, national life, public prosperity, probity of dealings, education of youth, and such like grave and momentous problems. He was interrupted in the writing by a letter from Mr. Alexander H. Everett, Minister Plenipotentiary of the United States at Madrid, whom he had previously met at Paris, and who had at his request attached him to the embassy. This letter contained his passport and the preposition from Mr. Everett that he should translate Navarrete's Voyages of Columbus, which was then in the press. It was compiled by this accomplished scholar from the papers of Columbus, as preserved by the famous uh, Bishop Lacassus, and of extracts from his journal, and it contained, as Irving found shortly after his arrival at Madrid, many documents hitherto unknown, which threw additional light on the discovery of the New World, but was defective as a whole, at any rate for his purpose, in that it was rather a rich mass for history than history itself. He abandoned, therefore, the idea of translating it, and began to institute fresh researches of his own account, examining manuscripts and taking voluminous notes for a regular life of a great navigator. Voluminous notes for a regular life of a great navigator. Okay, there you go. Irving commenced his task in February 1826 and labored upon it unceasingly for 6 months, sometimes writing all day until 12 at night. His attention was diverted from it in August by the conquest of Granada, which so interested him that he had devoted himself to it until November, when he threw aside the rough draft and returned to his greater work, which was not ready for the press until July of the following year. Leslie Murray about the had sounded Murray about the latter before it was begun, but the wily publisher fought shy at first. He would gladly, he said, receive anything from you of original matter which he considers certain of success, whatever it might be. But in regard to the voyages of Columbus, he cannot form any opinion at present. When the manuscript was finished, Irving sent it to England to the care of his friend Colonel Aspinwall, American consul at London, whom he made his agent in the disposal of it and wrote a letter to Murray in which he stated the sum he wanted for it, 3,000 guineas, but also stated that he would be willing to publish on shares. Colonel Aspinwall, Aspinwall, played his cards so well that Murray concluded not to publish it on shares, but to pay the 3,000 guineas out and out. The manuscript was shown to Southey, Southey, who pronounced the most unqualified praise of it, both as to manner and matter. And Murray himself said it was beautiful, beautiful, the best thing Irving had ever written. By the publication of the Life and Voyages of Columbus in 1828, the popularity of Irving, which had waned somewhat since the days when he first burst into the world of English readers in his sketchbook, rose anew and shone with greater luster. Hmm. The importance of this work was recognized on both sides of the water as well as the brilliancy of its execution. Jeffrey, who reviewed it in the Edinburgh, declared that it was not only excellent, but it would endure. For we mean, he exclaimed, not merely that the book will be known and referred to 20 or 30 years hence, it will pass in solid binding in every considerable collection, but that it will supersede all former works on the same subject and never be itself superseded. Not less enthusiastic was the carefully considered opinion of Irving's friend Everett, who originally suggested a translation from Navarrete, out of which it had grown, and who pronounced it in the North American Review, one of the few books which are at once the delight of readers and the despair of critics. Quote, it is as nearly perfect as any work can be, and there is little or nothing left for the reviewer but to write at the bottom of every page, as Voltaire said he would be obliged to do if he published a commentary on Racine, Pulchre bene optime. Uh, okay, whatever that means. Okay. Um, he has at least filled up the void that before existed in this respect in the literature of the world and produced a work which will fully satisfy the public and supersede the necessity of any future laborers in the same field. While we venture to predict that thing is happening again, y'all. Hold on, let's switch glasses. See if I can see that a little clearer consistently. Ooh, maybe not. Okay. While we venture to predict that the adventures of Columbus will hereafter be read only in the work of Mr. Irving, we cannot but think it a beautiful coincidence that the task of duly celebrating the achievements of the discoverer of our continent should have been reserved for one of its inhabitants, and that the earliest professed author of first-rate talent who appeared among us should have devoted one of his most important and finished works to this pious purpose. A little quote here. Such honors Ilion to her hero paid, and peaceful sleep. And peaceful slept the mighty Hector's shade, wherever that comes from. Anyway, um, for the particular kind of historical writing in which Mr. Irving is fitted to labor and excel, the life of Columbus is undoubtedly one of the very best. Perhaps we may say, without fear of any mistake, the very best subject afforded by the annals of the world. The magnitude of the task which he had completed so satisfactorily left Irving leisure to make a tour which he had planned with his brother Peter, but the ill health of that gentleman, who now returned by slow stages to Paris, compelled him to forego the pleasure of his company and to replace it by the company of two Russian diplomatists, with whom he set out on March 1st by the diligence of Cordova. I'm sorry. He set out on March 1st by the diligence for Cordova. They reached Granada in safety, notwithstanding the robbers who were said to beset the roads and spend several days in traversing the city and its environs. From Granada, the travelers proceeded to Malaga, my bad, and hence by a uh, circuitous, cir- hmm, circuitous, and I know that's not how you say that word, route to Gibraltar. Circuitous. Okay, hold on, you guys. I gotta say that word again. Where'd it go? Okay, there it is. Okay. From Granada, the travelers proceeded to Malaga, and hence by circuitous route to Gibraltar, after which they started for Cadiz, where Irving left his companions, being impatient to get to Seville and to correct and complete the rough draft of the manuscript of the conquest of Granada, which diverted his attention for upwards of 3 months at Madrid while he was engaged upon his life of Columbus. You know, this is sounding more and more like bullshit right about here. Okay, I'm just saying. Y'all good? Okay. You say you like plenipotentiary? Okay. Yeah, Moore's got us interested in plenipotentiaries. They surely did. But let's continue. The summer heat being overpowering at Seville, Irving removed to a little country seat on a hill about 8 miles from Cadiz, of which its beautiful bay, of which and its beautiful bay, it commanded a view on one side, while another embraced the distant mountains of Ronda. Here he dispatched to England half the first volume of the Conquest of Granada as a fair sample of the whole, and authorized Colonel Aspinwall to dispose of it to Murray and any other leading and respectable bookseller for 2,000 guineas, or as near that sum as he could get. Before a month was over, he received a letter from Murray, who was waiting for the corrected copy of Columbus in order to issue a new edition, and he had purchased from Wilkie a sketch that he had made of Irving's likeness, which he meant to prefix to it. The second letter from Murray contained what Irving considered the best critique that he had ever had as his general reputation with the public. It was in relation to a monthly magazine which Murray was about to set up on a purely literary and scientific basis, in which he offered Irving £1,000 a year to edit, besides paying him liberally for any articles which he might contribute. In fact, the salary, with other offers for casual writing, would ensure him at least $7,000 a year. Irving declined Murray's proposal, as he had declined a similar one from Scott 9 years before, partly because it would oblige him to fix his residence out of America, and partly because he was unwilling to shackle himself with any periodical labor. Murray concluded to purchase his new book at the price which he had demanded, 2,000 guineas, and published it early in 1829 under the title of The Chronicle of the Conquest of Granada, not as a not as from the manuscript of Fray Antonio Agapita, Agapita, or mm, Agapita, Agapita, fuck it. Okay. Fray Antonio Agapita is also another surname. Okay. Um, Agapida, Fray, Fray, Antonio Agapita, Agapida, I believe is another surname that he adopted, but let's keep reading. That is from the manuscript of Fray Antonio Agapita, a nom de guerre which Irving had adopted, but as by Irving himself. That actually that kind of pissed off Irving, because he put his real name up there. Okay, let's continue. Um, but as by Irving himself, an unwarrantable liberty he thought, in that it made him gravely in his own name tell many round untruths, and made him also responsible as an author for the existence of the manuscript of Agapita. Coleridge regarded the work as a masterpiece of romantic narrative. Prescott believed that Irving availed himself of all the picturesque and animating movements of the period which he had treated, that he was not seduced from historical accuracy by the poetic aspect of his subject. And Bryant, a fine Spanish scholar as well as an admirable literary critic, maintained that it was one of the most delightful of his works, an exact history. For such it is. For such it is admitted to be by those who have searched most carefully the ancient records of Spain, yet so full of personal incidents, so diversified with surprising turns of fortune, and these wrought up with such picturesque effects, that, to use an expression of Pope, a young lady might read it by mistake for a romance. It is a pleasant thing for an author to win approbation from members of his own craft, much pleasanter on a whole, perhaps, than to win the less intelligent approbation of the public. But unfortunately for his ambition and his pocket, it is only the last which is of substantial benefit to him. It was now withheld from Irving, for the conquest of Granada did not sell. Before it saw the light of publication, Irving had returned to the line of biographic studies which its composition had interrupted, and was busy in tracing out the voyages of the companions of Columbus, and had it contemplation. I'm sorry, let me say this again. And had in contemplation a series of legends connected with the Moorish domination in Spain, upon which he wrote from time to time as the Spirit moved him. He made a second visit to Granada in May 1829, and lodged in the Alhambra, above the whose halls and courts he rambled about all hours of the day and night. While he was residing in this romantic old Moorish palace, he was appointed Secretary of Legation to London, whither he repaired whither he repaired to October. Whither he repaired in October, my bad. Here, two honors awaited him. The first being a gold medal of the value of 50 guinea, which he adjudged to him by the Council of the Royal Society of Literature. The other, the degree of LL.D., which was conferred upon him by the University of Oxford. Notwithstanding these honors, of which any man of letters might well be proud, and of the personal esteem and affection which he was regarded, there can be no doubt that his reputation had lessened since the publication of the sketchbook in 1820, and of the Life and Voyages of Columbus in 1828. Whether his immediate or latter works were of a lower order of literary excellence than these were admitted to possess, or whether that many-headed beast, the public, was weary of them, is a question I do not feel called upon to decide. It is enough to note here that his popularity was so greatly on the wane that he parted with the voyages of the companions of Columbus to Murray for only 500 guineas, and that his sharp business friend, Colonel Aspinwall, could only obtain 1,000 guineas for his next work, the Alhambra, and that not from Murray, and this not from Murray, but from Colburn and Bentley. Of the reception of these characteristic studies of old Spain and the old voyagers, I have no knowledge, except that Mr. Edward Everett wrote concerning the last in the North American Review, and that it was equal in literary value to any other of the same class, with the exception of the sketchbook, and that he should not be surprised if it were read as extensively as even that very popular production, and that the Prescott, I'm sorry, and that Prescott, the historian, characterized it in his History of Ferdinand and Isabella as the beautiful Spanish sketchbook of Irving's diplomatic life, his presentation at court, etc. I shall not speak, nor of the celebrities of whom he met, only one of whom is likely to interest now. That was Scott, who was then in London, a broken down old man on his way to Italy, and whom he met again at a family dinner at which he was the only stranger present. Ah, my dear fellow, said Scott, who was seated as he entered, time has dealt lightly with you since the last we met. The mind of the great magician flickered fitfully during the dinner. Now and then he struck up a story in his old way, but the light soon died out, his head sank, and his countenance fell when he saw that he had failed to bring out his points. When the ladies went upstairs after dinner, Lockhart said to his guest, Irving, give Scott your arm. Mm. The grand old man, mournful in ruin, took the arm that was offered him, and grasping his cane with the other hand, said, Ah, the times are changed, my good fellow, since we have went over to Eldon Hills together. It is all nonsense to tell a man that his mind is not affected when his body is in this state. They never again met, for the mighty minstrel died the next year, and Irving returned to America after an absence of 17 years, lacking 4 days. Irving's arrival was anticipated by his friends, who received him with the greatest uh, cordiality, cordiality, and gave him a public dinner at the City Hotel, which was presided over by his early friend, Chancellor Kent, who had so promptly dismissed him to the world of shades 30 years before. The ordeal was a trying one to the modest man of letters who had a nervous horror of personal publicity, but he acquitted himself creditably, as the newspapers of that day testify. It was, of course, the happiest moment of his life, and was rendered more so because it proved that the misgivings which had haunted him, that his countrymen believed he was alienated from them, were groundless. He spoke of the changes which had come over New York during his absence, the emotions which he had experienced when he beheld it as he sailed up the harbor, seated in the midst of his watery domain, with the sunshine lighting up its domes and the forest of masts at its piers as far as the eye could reach, and how his heart throbbed with joy and pride as he felt he had a birthright in the brilliant scene before him. I am asked how long I mean to remain here. They know but little of my heart or my feelings. Who can ask me this question? I answer, as long as I live. Here, the roof rang with bravos, handkerchiefs were waved, cheers were given over and over again, and he finally sat down, satisfied that he had done better than he expected. Shortly after this dinner, Irving repaired to Washington to settle his accounts with the government and to meet the friends of his early years, Mr. Lewis McLean, late minister to England, Henry Clay, General Jackson, and others. Returning to New York, he made a trip up the Hudson as far as Tarrytown, and thence to Saratoga and Trenton Falls. He meditated a tour in the western part of New York, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, but he changed his plans and joined an expedition to the far west in company with 3 commissioners appointed to treat with deputations of the different tribes of Indians. He started from Cincinnati on September 3rd, reached Independence, Missouri on the 24th of that month, Fort Gibson, Arkansas on October 9th and Montgomery Point at the mouth of the Arkansas early in November. A voyage by steamboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans and thence to Washington and so back to New York completed the tour. The ground over which he had traversed, which was then but little known to the inhabitants of the more civilized portions of the United States, the incidents with experiences of travel with which it was surrounded determined him to turn them to account. He set about a narrative of which he had seen and undergone in the midst of the avocations, and writing leisurely completed it by the end of the following year. It was entitled A Tour on the Prairies and was published in London in 1835 by Murray, from whom Colonel Aspinwall succeeded in obtaining £400 for it. What reception it met with in England, I know not. It was welcomed here, and by none more warmly than Edward Everett in the New American Review. To what class of compositions the present work belongs, he wrote, we are hardly able to say. It can scarcely be called a book of travels, for there is too much painting of manners and scenery and too little statistics. It is not a novel, for there is no story, and it is not a romance, for it is all true. It is a sort of sentimental journey, a romantic excursion in which nearly all the elements of several different kinds of writings are beautifully and gaily blended into a production almost sui generis. He then expressed his pride in Irving's sketches of English life and the gorgeous canvas upon which he had gathered in so much of the glowing imagery of Moorish times, but was more pleased to see how he came back laden with the poetic treasures or poetical treasures of the primitive wilderness and with spoils from the uninhabited desert. We thank him for turning these poor, barbarous steppes into classical land and joining his inspiration to that of Cooper in breathing life and fire into the circle of imagery which was not known before to exist for the purpose of the imagination. End quote. To revive perhaps the nom de plume by which he had become best known among English readers, Irving published The Tour on the Prairies as the first number of the Crayon uh, Miscellany. Miscellany, okay. It was followed. It's crazy. I got these books sitting here. That's crazy. I got these books sitting here. We got 7 more pages, family, and then we'll be done. And I'll end this reading. I appreciate you guys for being here. I don't know if it should have taken over 2 hours, but it is what it is. Okay. Um, it was followed in the course of 2 or 3 months by a second number entitled Albertsford and Newstead Abbey, for which Colonel Aspinwall obtained from Murray the sum of £4,000. I'm sorry, £400, with a promise of £200 more when the second edition should be reached. It appears to have been successful, for Colonel Aspinwall wrote to Irving, quote, Murray says Albertsford or Abbotsford delights everybody, especially the Lockharts, end quote. The third number of the Crayon Messalani, Legends of, Legends of Spain, was sent about 6 weeks later to the same publisher, who declined it at the price demanded, but put it to the press on the author's account, whereby Irving realized only £100. Not only after his return to the United States, applied Irving was applied to by Mr. John Jacob Astor, Astor, to write about his settlement of Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River. He declined the undertaking, being engrossed with other plans, but recommended his nephew, Mr. Pierre Monroe Irving, as one who might aid him in preparing the materials, in which case he would have no objection to putting the finishing hand to the work. Astor caught at the idea, and Mr. Prairie Irving, who was then in Illinois, came to New York at the request of his uncle, and the pair commenced their joint labors at a country house belonging to Miss Astor at Hell Gate. He paid his authors liberally, the younger for his industry as a compiler, the elder for his skill as a literary artist and the use of his name, and was fully satisfied with their endeavors to hand him down to prosperity as a colonist as well as a millionaire. Oh, what if colonists ain't colonizing, but it's actually writing shit? That'd be some crazy shit, wouldn't it? Yeah. Okay, that'd be some crazy shit. We only got a few more pages, so give me a minute. Kind of like hanging out with y'all. Give me a minute. Maybe we can get through with this in the next 15 or so. Maybe. I doubt it. I'm stumbling over stuff. But I hope you guys are enjoying this read. And that way we have a history as I pick other parts out of these volumes right here. Okay. All right. Where are we at? Right about here. Astoria was published in 1836. Mr. Edward Everett, speaking as usual through the North American, saw in it as a whole the impress of Irving's taste and sketches of life and character worthy of the pen of Geoffrey Crayon. And an anonymous writer in the London Spectator considered it the most finished narrative of such a series of adventures that were ever written. While Irving was residing at the country seat of Mr. Auster, where he had few companions, the poet Halleck and Charles Auster breasted, then a lad of 14, he met Captain Bonneville of the United States Army, a type of man not uncommon at the time, who had engrafted the hunter and the trapper upon the soldier, and in whom he was much interested. He met this gentleman again in the following winter at Washington, where he was engaged in rewriting and extending his traveling notes and making maps of the regions he had explored. And he purchased his materials, out of which, together with other facts and details gathered from different sources, conversations, journals of the captain's contemporary, and the like, he wrought a volume of frontier life, which was published in 1837 as The Adventures of Captain Bonneville, and for which Bentley paid him £900 for an English edition, which was £400 more than he had paid for Astoria. In the course of his home travels shortly after his return to America, Irving saw a rural site at Tarrytown on the Hudson, not far from the residence of his nephew Oscar, which struck his fancy. It considered it consisted of 10 acres when he purchased it in the summer of 1835, and contained a cottage about a century old, which he concluded to rebuild into a literary rookery in the old Dutch style. He accordingly set up an architect. He accordingly sent up an architect and workmen, who between them built him a stone house at considerable cost, in which, surrounded with Christmas greens, he was settled with his brother Peter in January 1837. In this cozy mansion, which he had first christened Walfrid's Roost, and Walfrid is Wolfert. Okay. And afterward, Sunnyside, he finished the adventures of Captain Bonneville, and his name still running on the might of old Spain, which he had illustrated so brilliantly in the life of Columbus. He commenced what promised to be a greater work than that, and which, like that, was to concern itself with the Castilian domination of the New World, the history of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. I did see that title when I was looking for these. Okay. Um, When he had made a rough draft of the groundwork of the first volume, he came down to the city to consult authorities in the New York Society Library, where he met Mr. Joseph G. Cogswell, whom he knew, and who asked him what new work he had in hand, sounding him in the interest of Prescott, who had lately published his history of Ferdinand and Isabella. Is Mr. Prescott engaged upon the American subject? Inquired Irving. He was told that he was, and that it was the conquest of Mexico. With a generosity of which few men could have been capable, Irving then and there abandoned his plan and desired Mr. Cogswell to say as much to Prescott, whose claim to it, supposing he had any, was certainly less than his own, in that he had merely collected materials for it. Prescott acknowledged his curiosity. Prescott acknowledged his courtesy in a grateful letter. Sorry, you guys. Prescott uh, acknowledged his courtesy in a grateful letter in which he dwelt upon the mortification that he have felt that he would have felt if he found him occupying the ground, and expressed a fear that the public would not. Oh God, I'm having trouble right here. Let me start back. Hey y'all, I gotta take a break. I'm sorry, I really gotta take a break. We only got about 4 more pages to go, and there's a poem in here. But anyway, I gotta go to the ladies' room. Give me a minute, you guys. Okay, you guys, I'm back. Sorry about that. Seven was out there barking at the whole neighborhood. It's like dogs out there singing and shit. Anyway, about 4 more pages. Hold on, let me find out where we were. Make sure we can get this right again. Terrytown, Sunnyside. Okay, Prescott. We're somewhere around Prescott. Let's start right here. With the generosity of which few men could have been capable, Irving then and there abandoned his plans and desired Mr. Cogswell to say as much to Prescott, whose claim to it, supposedly he had any, supposing he had any, was certainly less than his own, in that he had merely collected materials for it. Prescott acknowledged his courtesy in a grateful letter in which he found I'm sorry, give me a second, you guys. Okay, that might help. Courtesy and grateful letter, in which he dwelt upon the mortification in which he felt if he found him occupying the ground, and expressed a fear that the public would not. Seven? Hold on, y'all. I'm sorry. Hold I'm sorry, y'all. My dog is so excitable right about now. She's so excited she threw up on my rug. And if y'all know how that goes, that y'all know how that went. Okay. Anyway. I know dog drama. Yeah, that part, Gary. Okay, where are we at? All right. Prescott, we're still on this sentence right here. Prescott acknowledged his courtesy in a grateful letter in which he dwelt upon the mortification which he would have felt if he found himself occupying the ground, and expressed a fear that the public would not be so well pleased as himself by Irving's liberal conduct, of which he was not sure that he should have the right in their eyes to avail himself. Ooh, I'm still having trouble breathing, y'all. Okay. The giving of up of this great task, which occupied Prescott 5 years, left Irving at leisure to renew his early acquaintance with the British essayist and to revise a biographical study which he had executed some 15 years before. This was a Life of Goldsmith, which he had prepared at Paris for Giuliani, for a collection of British authors that he undertook to edit, and which he now rewrote for the family library, of which the Harpers were the publishers. This was followed by a second and much less important biographical study, the life of Margaret Davidson, the younger of the two American sisters, who had a childish talent for writing verse, which her friends called poetry, and who had died of consumption in her 16th year. Two political honors were offered Irving in his 55th year, one being a unanimous nomination as the mayor of New York from Tammany Hall. Bullshit. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Poppycock. I'm sorry if anybody's listening. Okay. Um, Unanimous nomination as mayor of New York from Tammany Hall, and the other the appointment of Secretary of the Navy from President Van Buren. He accepted neither, wisely preferring to the doubtful distinction they might have bestowed upon him the peaceful security of his cottage and the society of his relatives. The relinquishment of the conquest of Mexico left him at leisure for lesser undertakings, which he found in writing a series of papers for the Knickerbocker magazine, his connection with which lasted from March 1839 to March 1841. Before the latter date, February 10th, he received what he called the crowning honor of his life. It came in the shape of the appointment of minister to Spain, which was forwarded to him by Daniel Webster, who remarked when significant time had elapsed for the news to reach him, quote, Washington Irving is the most astonished man in New York, end quote. Hard upon his appointment, the new minister was called on to attend the dinner which the citizens of New York gave Dickens, at which it was decided that he must preside, and where he did preside with such trepidation, making one of the shortest dinner speeches on record. There, he said, as he concluded his broken sentences by proposing the health of Dickens as the guest of the nation, there, I told you I should break it down. I have done it. Irving embarked for Europe for a third time on April 10, 1841. He soon reached London, where he waited upon his friend Everett, then American minister, who presented him to Queen Victoria at the Levee. I wanted to say Levee, but Levee, where he met several of his old acquaintances, among them the ministers, Lord Aberdeen, Sir Robert Peel, etc., who were cordial in their recognitions. He also met at the dinner party of Mr. Everett's the poet and wit Rogers, who took him in his arms in a paternal manner, and at anniversary dinner at the Literary Fund, he met Moore, upon whom the cares of the world were thickening, and to whom he declared his intention of not speaking that Dickens dinner, as he had explained to the more glib-tongued poet still haunting his imagination with the memory of his breakdown. Irving hardly filled the character of an ambassador, not ambassador, not with the A, but with the E, as defined by Sir Henry Wotton, or Wooton, Wotton, i.e., one sent to lie abroad for the good of his country, end quote. For setting aside his natural incapacity for mendicancy, mendicancy, mendacity. Dang, I know that word too. The good of his country demanded nothing of the kind from him, whatever it may have done from our minister to England, who had the Oregon affair upon his hands. I'm sorry, let me read that again. That just didn't sound right. Irving hardly filled the character of an ambassador as defined by Sir Henry Wotton, i.e., one sent to lie abroad for the good of his country, for settling aside his natural incapacity for mendicity, or whatever. The good of his country demanded nothing of the kind from him, whatever it may have done from our minister to England, who had the Oregon affair upon his hands. The diplomatic life of Irving, which occupied 4 years, need not detain us long. From London he proceeded to Paris, where, as in duty bound, he called upon General Cass, our minister to France, who drove out with him one evening to Neuilly, and presented him to Louis Philippe, his queen, and his sister, Madame Adelaide, all of whom took occasion to say something complimentary about his writings. He arrived at Madrid on July 25th and installed himself in the apartments of his predecessor at the Hotel of the Duke of San Lorenzo. 6 days later, he had an audience of the Regent Impartero, Duke of Victoria. He was then driven to the royal palace and presented to the little queen, a child of 12, a puppet in the hands of intriguing statesmen who went through the part assigned to her with childish dignity. Irving's letters to his relatives are largely made up of accounts of the politics of the country to which he was accredited, and which are mildly described by the word stormy. The regent Espartero for example, was speedily overthrown, and the child queen was in the hands of Narvaez, Narvaez and his adherents, who issued juntas, pronunciamientos, and what not in the way of sounding and what not in the way of sounding public documents. He was a sagacious observer who could understand and a rapid penman who could narrate the events which Irving witnessed during his residence in Spain and which was his ambassadorial duty to communicate to his government. The amount of diplomatic business which now devolved upon him left him no time to perform a task which was so near his heart and upon which he had hoped to labor diligently. This was a life of Washington, which had been proposed to him by Constable, the publisher, in 1825, while he was residing at Paris, and which he declined at the time from a modest diffidence of his powers. Quote, I stand in too great awe of it, end quote, he wrote. Long brooded over and fairly begun at Wolfert's Roost, he made but little progress with it at Madrid. His post finally grew so irksome to him that he resigned it in December 1845 and impatiently awaited his successor, who appeared during the following summer in the person of General Romulus M. Saunders of North Carolina. Irving turned his back on the old world for the last time in London early in September 1846, and on the 19th of that month was at home once more in his beloved sunny side. The last years of Irving's life were passed in the enjoyment of his leisure and the honors that he had earned. His chief residence was at Sunnyside, though he made occasional journeys as in his early days, and his chief employment was the task upon which he had long set his heart, the life of Washington. Mm, okay, the life of Washington. Hold on. Um, and the collection and revision of a complete edition of his works, making of which were by time out of print. This edition, which was commenced in the summer of 1848, contained, in addition to a list of Irving's writings in the preceding pages, three later publications: Oliver Goldsmith, 1849, Muhammad and His Successors, 1850, and Wolfert's Roost, 1855. The first was a subject which had engaged his attention twice before, and to which he was led to return by the appearance of Forster's, Forster's Life of Goldstein, which he published, um, which his publisher thought of reprinting. This charming book so freshened the memory of his favorite author and stimulated the power of work that in less than 2 months the sheets of his third biographical study were in the printer's hands. Muhammad and His Successors, the last of the series of writings which he had projected during the first residence in Madrid, illustrated that the Moorish domination in Spain was originally prepared for Murray's family library in 1831, but circumstances prevented its publication at the time. It was thrown aside for years. The neglected manuscript was found by Minister Irving among his papers during the last residence in Spain, where he beguiled the uh, tediousness of illness by revising it, profiting as he did so by the light which later writers had shed upon the subject, particularly Dr. Gustav Well, Weil, librarian of the University of Heidelberg, who is still an authority among the biographers, biographers, my bad, of the great Arabian prophet. This addition to the body of his writings, excellent as they were in themselves and important as they would have been in the life of a lesser author, were merely diversions from the labor which consistently occupied his mind and his pen as they slowly but surely proceeded with his Life of Washington, the first volume of which was published shortly after Waldorf's Roost in 1855. the fifth and last volume in 1859, a few months before his death. Irving died on the night of November 28, 1859, and all that was mortal of him was buried on the 1st of December at Tarrytown. He was a beautiful, it was a beautiful winter day, clear and sunny, radiant with the still lingering Indian summer, which shed a soft and melancholy light over the solemn scene. It was one of his own days, says the mourners, as he rode from Sunnyside to Christ's Church, where the funeral services were held, and hence to the cemetery about a mile distance on the side of a hill, with a view of the Hudson on one side, and on the other side the valley of Sleepy Hollow, classic ground, which the genius of Irving has made immortal. Immortal. Hold on, y'all. I'm getting there. It's this poem that's coming up. All right, here we go. I hate this shit. Okay. His youth was innocent, his riper age, marked with some act of goodness every day, and watched by eyes that loved him calm and sage, faded his late decline years away. Merely he gave his being up and went to share the holy rest that awaits a life well spent. That life was happy every day he gave, thanks to the fair existence that was his. For the sick fancy made him not a slave to mock him with the phantom's miseries. Yeah, whatever. Um, no chronic tortures racked his aged limb, for luxury and sloth had nourished both of him, or had nourished none of him for him. And I am glad that he lives thus long, and glad that he has gone to his reward. Nor can I deem that nature did him wrong, softly disengaged the vital cord. For when his hand grew palsied and his eye faint with the marks of age, it was his time to die. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Last paragraph, and we are done with this reading. Okay. So sang the greatest of our poets, Bryant, in his early manhood in The Old Man's Funeral, a touching poem in which he celebrates a blameless life like that of Irving. And in his oration in memory of the latter, a few months after his death, he addressed his departed friend in the following eloquent words, quote, "Farewell, thou hast entered into the rest prepared from the foundation of the world for serene and gentle spirits like thine. Farewell, happy in thy life, happy in thy death, happy in the reward to which that death was the assured passage, fortunate in attracting the admiration of the world to thy beautiful writings, still more fortunate in having written nothing which did not tend to promote the range of magnanimous forbearance and generous sympathies among thy fellow men. The lightness of that enduring frame which thou hast won on earth is but a shadowy symbol of the glory to which thou art admitted in the world beyond the grave. Thy errand, thy errand upon earth was an errand of peace and goodwill to men, and thou art in a region where hatred and strife never enter, and where the harmonious activity of those who inhabit it acknowledge no impulse less noble and no holy than that of love." End quote. And that concludes our reading of at least the first chapter of Washington Irving's work, Volume 1, the sketchbook, Legends of the Conquest of Spain and Life of Washington Irving. If we come back on this again, this next chapter for Volume 1, which really starts on page number 49, uh, it's the sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon, okay? Um, and this is the author's account of himself, which y'all know how that's going to go. Then it goes into the sketchbook, The Voyage, um, which is only a couple pages up from there. And then we get into the real reading of that particular part that deals with Jeffrey Crayon. So we're ending this right here on page number 48. And this was what was written about Washington Irving by Henry, I'm trying to get his middle name, Richard Henry Stoddard, in this volume set that I had gotten, that I found most curious because it had something about the fall of Granada and also Moorish Chronicles and a few other little curiosities like New York. But at least what we have right now is an overview of when these books were written in his life. Like I said it a couple times, I think there were some embellishments in a lot of this. Like y'all met that many people, my goodness, okay, in your travels or whatever. But hey, who knows? Who knows? They weren't in the interior at the time. So anyway, family, that's it for me. I appreciate you guys for coming through. I didn't mean to hold you that long in reading that. I didn't know how much I was going to read because, like I said in the beginning of this, I was tired. I started to get sleepy and stuff like that. But it got kind of interesting. The picture was painted for me. And you know, the one thing that we have to do in all things that are going on is we still have to read. We have to break down different readings that we read, look behind it, use common sense, this, that, and the other, but somehow get a picture and not just regurgitate old things that have been said over and over again in the current environment. So I welcomed this reading, and no one's under an obligation to come as as I do more of these, but I just got to spin out of the narratives that's going on right now. It's you lose brain cells and run into walls and shit behind that stuff. So anyway, family, we're gonna go on and hit this outro, and I'm gonna go on and get out your way and then go find out why so many people left, because I know somebody else is up. Okay, and see how they do later on. So I appreciate you guys. Leave some comments down there in the comments section about what we read. You know, it ain't my book. I just read it. Okay. So peace, family. Let me go on and get this outro in here. And thank you all for coming and listening. Those who came in the beginning, those who are still here behind the scenes, because I know how that goes. And those of you who are counted in the chat right here. Appreciate you guys for coming. Okay. And listening. Maybe it fits somewhere in your narrative of the things that you're looking at. All right. So peace, family. This is your girl Navi. I'm out. How y'all going? Now, how come you didn't just play the damn outro? Okay.